So I want to focus first on the spending side. It turns out there are really two arguments that advocates for the stimulus made back in January, February. Okay? And they're very different arguments, but they were almost always mushed together and confused. One argument for extra government spending says the government has good things to do. Okay? We need more roads. We need to have more teachers per pupil, so we need more spending on education. We need more green energy, so we should be subsidizing wind farms or things like that. Okay? The second argument, the one I just explained, the strict Keynesian argument, okay, says it doesn't matter what we spend on, as long as we spend more. The first one I'll refer to as the cost-benefit argument. It just says the government may have good projects that it can carry out that the private sector for some reason is not carrying out. Okay? That's one argument. The different argument is the Keynesian argument. If you go back and look at what people were saying about the spending, you'll see very clearly those two things were often muddied together in the advocacy for the stimulus. Now let's consider the first claim, that there's lots of good projects, that there was $500, $600, $800 billion worth of additional spending that the government should have been doing just because it was good spending for the government to be doing. If that was true, if the government has new roads that would really be productive for the economy, of course the government should build those roads. Okay? If it turns out that more government spending for education, say more loans for people to go to college, are really going to add to the overall productivity of the economy, then of course having the government provide those loans, okay, is a perfectly fine idea. Okay? It has nothing to do with the recession. It has to do with the fact that in some cases, the private sector might not do certain things that would be productive for the overall economy that maybe the government can do. Roads is a pretty standard example, a pretty convincing example. Okay, for any individual or any company to get all the permissions to build roads all the way across the country might be somewhat overwhelming. Maybe you need government to coordinate a project like that. Okay? But okay, my judgment is that in fact, relative to where the US was, is approximately now, the notion that there was lots of additional productive spending is incredibly unpersuasive. Okay? So I want to explain that view, my claim that in practice, in fact, okay, in the US economy in 2009, there was hardly anything that the government should have been spending more money on, okay, and therefore the cost-benefit argument for stimulus is not convincing. So why do I say that? First of all, it's important to emphasize that the question is not whether some government expenditure is a good idea. Some size military, some amount of government roads, some amount of government support for education. The question was, should we have done much more starting from where we already were with very high levels of all those things, okay, in 2009? Clearly you can make a case that we should have some government spending on roads, but that doesn't justify building zillions of roads. It doesn't say that we should spend enough money to repair every road system every 6 months, because doing that means you interfere with traffic all the time and you don't make the road much better, so the cost would be much greater than any benefit from that extra spending on roads at some point. So where do we think the US is? Why should we think that the US is probably not underspending and maybe overspending, okay, taking into account that there's going to be diminishing benefits of additional spending on any given category? Mainly because there clearly are very strong, powerful interest groups that are constantly pushing for more spending. So there's clearly a bias towards spending, okay, for it to be too much rather than too little. For building projects, for road projects, construction companies and unions, of course, would love the government to build new roads every single day, no matter what, to have the entire sort of country paved with superhighway, because that's good for that particular interest group. Okay? Teachers' unions would like to convince everyone that class sizes as low as 15 or 10 or 5, okay, are really much better than class sizes of 25, because then there's a lot more demand for teachers, and that's good for teachers' unions. Okay? Academics, economists included, they're just as guilty as everyone else, would like to convince everyone that there's always more good research to be done that the private sector won't fund, okay, and therefore the government should fund it. Why? Because that's good for academics. It pays our summer salaries, it gives us research assistants and new computers and all sorts of other goodies. Okay? And green spending is the same way. There's zillions of businesses who make their living off of green spending. Their main customer is the federal government. So of course they would like the federal government to always be spending more on cleaner energies and so forth. Okay? So there are strong biases toward too much spending. So we shouldn't have assumed back in February of 2009 that clearly we were spending too little. There was a very strong possibility we were already spending too much from a cost-benefit productivity perspective. before committing additional dollars, okay, additional expenditure on any of these activities, we should have wanted to see compelling, convincing, calm, rational analyses. The administration never offered anything like that. What it offered was assertions. More spending is always good. Okay? That's incredibly unpersuasive and is almost certainly not true in many of those instances. Okay? And so that's the third part of the reason to be incredibly suspicious. Finally, the reason to be suspicious of the cost-benefit argument for more spending is, how is it that you can actually find those projects that make sense? By taking your time, by having economists, accountants, lawyers, and others study the issue, by doing careful cost-benefit analyses. But in a crisis, in 2009, we didn't do any of those things. We didn't take the time to figure out what projects made sense and what projects didn't. We just decided that there were zillions of shovel-ready things to be spent on that were good projects, and we were going to plow ahead and spend money as fast as possible. Let me give one illustration of how loony that notion is. I live in Wellesley, Massachusetts, which is next door to Newton, Massachusetts. Going back about 9 or 10 years, Newton decided they were going to build a new high school. They fought about it, argued about it, spent tons of money on consultants and designs and architects and all that. About 5 years. They finally built the thing. It was unmitigated disaster. The heating didn't work, the cooling didn't work, the internet didn't work, the parking was a mess. I mean, it was just a huge, huge, huge mess. Partially, I guess, because it was designed by a committee. Committees tend to sort of muck things up. Okay? So they had all the time in the world, okay, and they got it seriously wrong. Wellesley, okay, is actually just doing the construction now after having spent 5, 6 years arguing about it. Okay, and it's going to take another 3 years. So even if it comes out perfectly, which it probably won't, it still took 8 years for that project. Those examples fly in the face of the notion that at any point in time there's tons of shovel-ready stuff, and that therefore the government can just spend like a drunken sailor and it will be good for the economy, it will be productive. Okay? The reality is incredibly different. So, let's look at the other possible argument, okay, for the additional spending. Okay? I'm not going to go through as much of the gory detail, but to remind you, the argument for strictly Keynesian spending says if the government pays people to dig ditches and fill them back up, that's good for the economy. That's what the model literally says. If the government hires people to make toaster ovens or cars or computers and throw them in the ocean, that's good for the economy. That's what the model literally says. Okay? Now, you may think that's just completely insane and you should just stop there. It turns out if you make enough weedy, wonky, complicated assumptions, you can almost make that argument seem sort of rational, but it's still a model. It's still a lot of assumptions. You shouldn't take it at face value. We shouldn't regard it as God's truth. We should subject it to empirical examination, which is what economists do with every model that economists propose. So it only makes sense to rely on it if there's good evidence to support it. Relatedly, we should only rely on the Keynesian model, and particularly emphasis on spending, if the evidence says that spending is much better at stimulating the economy than tax cuts. Okay? So what does the evidence say? The evidence says, okay, pretty clearly, not totally unambiguously, but pretty clearly that there's very little evidence to think, sorry, something just, I hit something by mistake. God's is striking me down. The evidence says pretty strongly that spending is not very effective at stimulating the economy. The evidence says quite clearly that tax cuts are very effective at stimulating the economy. Now that's which makes a lot of sense. What happens when governments cut tax rates? Okay? It increases the incentive for people to save, to work, to invest. That's good for the economy. It leads to a more productive economy. Okay? So if the Keynesian model is true, then tax cuts are good for the economy. Okay? If it's not true, but the standard microeconomics about tax cuts is right, which lots and lots of evidence supports, then the tax cuts are still good for the economy. If the evidence is approximately right, then the spending increases are not especially good for the economy. So what would a prudent person have done? I think a prudent person would have emphasized the stimulus based on tax cuts, not on spending increases. So what did we do? We adopted a stimulus that was almost entirely based on spending increases. My advisors from M.I.T. are trying to punish me somehow.